So hi everybody, happy Tuesday. Thanks so much for joining us today for the third installment of our Addressing Commercial Sexual Exploitation, a Framework for the Youth Legal System series. My name is Alex Miller, and I'm the Deputy Director for Multisystem Operations here at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. My colleague Macon Stewart and I actually recently presented at and attended the National Missing and Unidentified Persons Conference in Las Vegas. And that experience really just further solidified the dire importance of not only educating professionals and communities on the topic of commercial sexual exploitation, but it really highlighted why it's so pressing to develop ways to respond to and prevent these horrors from occurring. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. So as I mentioned, this is the third webinar in the series. In the first webinar, we explored the various myths and stereotypes that can cloud our understanding of commercial sexual exploitation and how very necessary it is to uplift stories to overcome false narratives. In the second webinar, we learned how to establish a foundation for systematically combating CSE and its accompanying risks, during which our speakers taught us about the development of the Los Angeles County Probation Department's Child Trafficking Unit. And if you haven't had a chance to check out those first two installments of this series, they are available on our website, and the link for that will be dropped in the chat shortly. So today, in the third and final webinar, which is titled Policy Solutions and Lessons Learned for Combating Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children, our speakers are going to round things out with a detailed discussion on how individuals with lived experience and cross-system collaboration can and should inform prevention and intervention related policy around this very important subject. And we at CJJR have a really keen understanding of the monumental role that interagency collaboration and the centering of youth and families in these collaborations can have in strengthening communities. In fact, this is actually just the premise for our crossover youth practice model, which if you're interested, you can also learn more about on our website. The link for that will be dropped in the chat shortly as well. Today's speakers are in a unique position to instruct on this topic. They themselves have built and sustained infrastructure, policies, and practices to disrupt commercial sexual exploitation of children, to decriminalize CSE survival, and to empower communities to protect and support those who are made marginalized and vulnerable. And so with that said, it's truly an honor to introduce April Grayson, Senior Policy Manager with the Sister Warriors Freedom Coalition, May Ackerman-Brimberg, a Senior Attorney with the National Center for Youth Law's Collaborative Responses to Commercial Sexual Exploitation Initiative, and Dr. Carly Durkheising, Associate Professor with the School of Criminal Justice and Criminalistics at Cal State LA. And before I pass the mic to them, I do want to note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared with you. And we will also have time at the end for Q&A, but I encourage you to go ahead and drop your comments and questions in the chat as they arise. And so on that note, April, Carly, and May, over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. Welcome, everyone, and thank you, CJJR, for having us. We're very excited to be here today to talk about our experiences, our lessons learned, and our current thinking about future directions and policy making for individuals and communities impacted by commercial sexual exploitation, or CSE, we'll refer to it as often. We'll take questions at the end. We're going to save some time, but if you want to throw any questions into the chat during the presentation, we're happy to multitask. My name is Carly Durkheising, and I'm fortunate to be presenting alongside my esteemed colleagues. Next slide, please. May Ackerman-Brimberg and April Grayson. And next slide, please. Before we kick off, I just want to note two things. First, the impetus behind this webinar series was to spread the word about this NIJ guide that we released early last year. So it's an implementation and assessment guide for specialized units serving youth experiencing CSE and probation and child welfare. But there are a lot of other helpful tools and content in it. We've covered different pieces of it and along with other content in the prior two webinars, and we hope people were able to listen to those as well. This final webinar builds off the final chapter in this guide where we describe some lessons learned. But today we're gonna take it one step further to also include our current calls to action for each of those lessons learned. So with that, I'll pass it over to May.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. I'm May Ackerman Brimberg, she, her pronouns, from the National Center for Youth Law. So we wanted to start today by highlighting that there are really a lot of different opportunities for legal and policy change when we're thinking about how to address and prevent commercial sexual exploitation. So what you're seeing here is a report card from the organization Shared Hope International, and there's one for each state. So we encourage you to go look that up for your state to see kind of where you're doing. And as I mentioned, it's really up to each community to figure out kind of what their priorities are, and that should be driven by community engagement and survivor leadership on where to focus. So we're looking right now at California's report card, and you can see that overall we're getting a C, which is not bad, but it's not great. And you can see that there's been a heavier focus in certain areas. So there's been a lot of emphasis on criminal provisions like, criminal provisions related to traffickers, and on prevention and training, but there's been a lot less focus on identification of and response to victims, as well as continuum of care. And when we talk to young people and families and those who have direct experience, those are really the areas that they prioritize, that identification and service provision. So we see that we still have a lot of work to do. So again, encourage you all as a starting point to kind of do a self-assessment of where you are, and each report card also comes with a description, a detailed description of the types of laws that are on the books in each jurisdiction. It's a really great resource. We also wanted to point out to you another resource from a toolkit that our organization, the National Center for Youth Law, put together. There's a worksheet that here's one that's filled in, but there are blank ones within the toolkit that walk you through kind of the different areas that you could focus on in thinking about legal and policy change. So as some examples, changes to child abuse and neglect definitions, ensuring that trafficking is included in your child abuse laws, looking at penal code. So are we arresting, and we'll talk about this a lot more today, are we continuing to arrest and prosecute young people? Safe harbor laws to ensure that if folks are arrested either for exploitation related things or other, they are not, there's protections in the legal process. There are laws related to multidisciplinary collaboration and how we can do that, who should be involved, and how we do information sharing safely, requiring services, the types of services, funding for those services, protections in the court process, and of course, prevention and training. So all of these things are areas that are kind of ripe for policy change. And again, we encourage you all to do a self-assessment, and I'll give you the link to the toolkit in a moment so you can look at that a little bit closer. So next, we wanted to just frame out today's session with some of the policy changes that have happened in California over the last decade or so. So some of you might have heard this before, but our team really began working on this issue almost 15 years ago when one of the attorneys from Nickel was working in a collaborative court in Alameda County here in Oakland, California, that was a mental health court for girls. And one of the young people came up to the attorneys and said, look, all of us are here for prostitution. And we just knew as a youth serving organization that was not acceptable. These kids were being locked up in juvenile hall for something that had happened to them, for abuse that was happening to them. So in the early years of the policy change, we were really focused on how do we shift this away from a juvenile justice response to a child welfare response. So in 2014, Nickel, along with a coalition of advocates across California, helped to pass SB 855, which clarified that commercial sexual exploitation is child abuse and that young people may be served by the child welfare system. It also, very importantly, created a statewide CSEC program that dedicates $20 million annually to counties to provide services and supports and to better identify young people. And this is an ongoing budget allocation. Nearly all of the 58 counties, I believe it's 48 or 49 of the 58 counties in California have opted into that program. And to the note in the introduction, one of the really important pieces of the CSEC program is that it requires collaboration. So each county that opts in is required to create a multidisciplinary protocol and have a steering committee with a certain number of certain identified participants to ensure that there is collaboration around this issue. Once we had kind of set up the infrastructure within the child welfare system and within counties to better serve young people outside of the juvenile justice system, in 2017, we helped to pass SB 1322, which rendered the provisions within California's penal code related to prostitution and loitering with intent inapplicable to minors, so that young people could no longer be arrested for prostitution. We also helped to pass a law in 2018 regarding training for law enforcement. And I'm going to pass it over to April in a moment to talk about some of our recent work. But before I do that, just wanted to note that there are a lot of other laws on the books that we aren't focusing on here. Where we're focusing is really on services and supports and identification of those who have been impacted. As I noted, there are many criminal laws and other things related to this issue, but we're not focusing on those here. So I'll turn it over to April to talk about the Justice for Survivors.
Thank you, May. So in 2021, a group of amazing advocates came together. And what we realized is that there were many nuances that weren't being addressed between people who were deemed as perpetrators and people who were victims and not being seen as victims. And so we worked on a bill called Justice for Survivors, which was AB 124, and it would expand the affirmative defense and it would allow for trauma-informed plea negotiations, sentencing and resentencing. And there was also a vacatur piece. And so we were able to pass that bill in 2021. We had taken some serious amendments that had excluded people with more serious or violent offenses out of the bill. Sadly, I was one of those people. And so we came back. So in 2022, what we realized is that we needed to educate California because California was not is not aware of what a victim looks like. We have this cookie cutter idea and we were missing people. And so in 2023, we came back and we worked on another version of 124, which would expand the bill and allow for people with more serious offenses to be able to have a holistic journey through the criminal legal system, which did not pass. Also, at this time, we were seeing some harmful bills that were coming forward, but they looked very harmless as they were addressing some serious issues in the trafficking realm. But because the language in the bill did not help or direct people to identify survivors, the bill was still going to be harmful to people who were survivors. And so here we are again in 2024. We are now working on AB 2354, which is an expansion of 124, which is solely going to work on the vacatur piece. So people who have been sentenced, charged, and have served their time will be able to apply for a vacatur and hopefully finally be seen as survivors in California.
Thank you, April. So for the remainder of the session today, as Carly noted, we'll share some lessons learned from California, including from LA County, where we've done a lot of kind of more detailed and innovative work. And as we share the lessons learned, we'll share some examples of policy and practice changes. So the first thing we wanted to share was about the LA County First Responder Protocol. So prior to the legal changes in, well, let me take a step back. Forgot to say, the first thing we wanted to talk about is taking a leap of faith. So that a lot of this work really requires kind of courage and innovation and a willingness to try something new. So that's the big first lesson learned. So prior to some of the legal changes that I just spoke about that prevented minors from being arrested for prostitution across California, we were working with a group of folks within Los Angeles County, some of whom are on the call. I'll give a shout out to Michelle Guyman, who was one of the presenters on our earlier sessions and really a champion in this space. So we were working with a collaborative group of folks within LA County that were learning about this issue and decided they wanted to try something different. So again, at the state level, young people could still be arrested for prostitution, and this, collaborative group within the county decided we want to try to stop that. We know that it's wrong, and let's try something new. So in collaboration with a number of different county agencies, child welfare, probation, law enforcement, mental health services, along with community-based organizations and survivor leaders, we developed the Law Enforcement First Responder Protocol, which is a service-based response that's used as an alternative to arrest and detention of young people, and it's still being used today. The way it works is that when law enforcement identifies a child who's at risk of or experiencing CSE, they make a call to the Child Protection Hotline to make a report of child abuse. And within 90 minutes, an emergency social worker or a probation officer, if they have one, and importantly, a community-based advocate respond. So rather than punishing the young person, the goal is really to meet their immediate needs in that moment. So the advocates bring clean clothes, food, a backpack, sometimes with a teddy bear, because remember, these are kids who have just gone through something really difficult and need comfort and care. And then there's connection with a community, with a health screening, and the young person can get any emergency mental health services that they might need. And a crisis multidisciplinary team meeting happens. And importantly, there's follow-up within 72 hours and ongoing as needed. And committing to this process early on really did require that leap of faith. We were asking people to do something different that felt uncomfortable. And as the story goes, Michelle can attest to this, law enforcement and others were reluctant to try it. They didn't think it would work. And there was just kind of a discussion of let's give it a shot, let's see what happens. And when that first call came in, law enforcement was sitting there, tapping their watch, waiting to see if anyone would show up. And lo and behold, at the 72-minute mark, the advocates arrived. And everyone kind of thought, okay, maybe this can work. In the last 10 years, there have been approximately 1,450 recoveries through the FRP, with nearly 1,000 unique young people, because some people are identified more than once. Also around this time, LA County got some funding to create alternatives to supporting young people who are on probation. You heard about this in the last webinar, the child trafficking unit within probation and the STAR Court, both of which really emphasize trauma-informed collaborative processes as opposed to punitive ones. And as I noted, a really important piece of all of this was collaboration. This is not just about child welfare, law enforcement, or probation. It's really about bringing folks together to serve young people. Carly, I'll turn it over to you.
So looking ahead, when we think about our call to action for taking our next leap of faith, is really that we must move beyond youth incarceration, period. The research is conclusive at this point. It overwhelmingly shows poor outcomes for youth who experience incarceration. The collateral consequences, such as increased risk for ongoing justice involvement as an adult, there's lower academic attainment, challenges securing employment, financial aid for college, housing, and so on. In addition, for youth who are experiencing CSE, and particularly for girls, what we see is a unique pathway to incarceration or justice contact at all. And that's one that's characterized by trauma, sexual violence, and delinquent behaviors that are associated with trying to escape abuse and trauma, such as running away. So it's essentially the criminalization of victimization and trauma. That is what we need to move away from. Girls are also more likely to be incarcerated for lower level offenses. And we hear repeatedly that girls are being locked up for reasons related to their vulnerabilities rather than for public safety. And public safety is the only legal reason a child should ever be incarcerated. So for instance, we hear things like, I don't want anything bad to happen to her on the street, so I'm going to detain her to keep her safe. That thinking ultimately leads to girls and other youth being incarcerated related to their housing situations, for instance, such as leaving care without permission, or simply not even being able to find an available home for that youth. However, this thinking is counterproductive because incarceration is increasing exposure to trauma, and multiple studies have shown now that youth who come into a secure facility with a history of trauma are actually more likely to experience trauma while they're incarcerated. So these reasons, and the fact that youth incarceration does not reduce recidivism, plus it's incredibly expensive, are part of the push to serve youth in the community rather than in facilities. And in calling for this shift, we also need to be sure that we are resourcing our community-based organizations so that they can fully support and serve youth. And we'll dig more into community-based orgs a bit later in the webinar. There's several counties in California that are working on ways to reduce incarceration, including examining how bench warrants are used and cleared. For instance, youth currently have to come to juvenile hall to have a bench warrant cleared. Is that necessary? Not always. So what can we do about that? Also, for those interested, if you just give a click, there's a QR code here that will take you to the Vera Institute of Justice's page. They're working on this issue at the national and the local level as part of their Ending Girls Incarceration initiative. They've done this in several jurisdictions. So for example, in Hawaii, they were able to get to 0 girls incarcerated at one point. And in California, they're working in 4 counties right now to identify ways to reduce incarceration among girls and gender expansive youth. And Nickel may support. They are a subcontractor and helping them make that connection between girls incarceration and CSE. Next slide.
Can I add something really fast?
Yes, please.
And recently we've seen a few institutions be exposed for severely abusing children for numbers and numbers of years. We've seen it in the children's receiving home and the children's juvenile halls. And so these reports have been highlighting that these highly vulnerable, exploited youth are now being placed in environments that are extremely exploitive and causing more harm. And so the systems that we have had to protect these children actually aren't protecting the children. And so we need to create better structures and foundations so that we can keep our children safe.
Exactly. Thank you, April. So another lesson learned is around training and awareness building. In Los Angeles in 2017, the Board of Supervisors mandated training for all county employees on commercial sexual exploitation, essentially a CSEC 101. And this was an incredibly helpful step in raising awareness across a wide array of individuals and workers across the county. This was also important because it really helped the folks who perhaps didn't realize or didn't think that they were really coming across this issue to really see it in a new light. So our colleague, who we continually reference, Michelle Guyman, she always gives this example of the people working in public works who didn't think they were coming across this at all once they were in the training, realizing because they were in the community as part of their work, they were seeing it. But even for folks who should expect to come across those impacted by exploitation, sometimes don't even realize it. So for example, we recently spoke with some folks who work with families when their child welfare cases close. And there was this general sense that they aren't working with youth who are exploited or they don't come across them in their work, but we know that they do. So training isn't the end of awareness building. Next slide. As we become more prepared to respond to exploitation, there is a need to really move beyond identification to prevention and service provision, which is kind of what May alluded to at the beginning there. Ultimately, that now what do we do? So we've long recognized that prevention is a huge gap. For a few reasons. There's, I think, been a really crisis mode response to commercial sexual exploitation, which makes prevention feel kind of almost unattainable at times. But also there's generally a lack of focus on prevention among our child serving systems and our healthcare systems across the nation. But as we continue to do this work, prevention is becoming the most obvious and vital issue. And prevention really needs to happen in schools. So that awareness building that happens with service providers and county employees needs to also be happening with kids and young kids as well, especially because of the influence and the dangers of social media. We've heard from many youth and families in our recent listening sessions that they want this. They want to learn about this. They wish they had known about this. They wish they knew what to look out. Families wish they knew what to look out for before it happened to them. We also need to be thoughtful about how we're raising awareness. So, for example, there was a big push for billboards around the county to raise awareness on human trafficking. But we heard from families that they would see those and think, oh, that happens in other countries, or that's not happening in my community. So this means we need to be getting the information to children, youth, and families in avenues that they're paying attention to and in ways that resonate from them or for them. Often through peers and other parents and caregivers, we found is really a really useful mechanism. And then as a researcher, I would also add that we can also build awareness through research and evaluation of best practices and prevention and intervention efforts. The research is pretty minimal at this point on what works. There's not a lot of it, but there's a lot of programs out there that youth and families say are helping them. So we need to be more thoughtful and flexible in the types of practices and programs that we want to or can research. So for instance, traditional randomized control trial designs are often not possible with some of these interventions because the length of time it's taking to engage youth in services. Also because many youth may be coming in and out of treatment or in and out of services because of leaving care or other things going on related to their exploitive situations. And also because so much of the work is relationship building, which is not always measured in traditional intervention research. So we really need more research and evaluation as part of awareness building. We need to be flexible in how we carry out this research in terms of methodology. We need to be more thoughtful about what we consider success or what we measure for our outcomes and how we measure it. We really need to hear from individuals. We need individual level data. So we need to be hearing directly from youth and families. A lot of the research right now uses administrative data, which is only telling us a little slice of the story. And we need to be conducting this type of research with those with lived experience who can provide the expertise to contextualize and interpret the findings, along with the challenges that we encounter in this type of research. All right, next slide.
Thanks, Carly. And just one other plug on that, part of the NIJ guide that Carly mentioned in the beginning is a youth survey that we developed. We may have mentioned this in the previous sessions, but I'm going to mention it again in the interest of being able to build that data and really listen to young people. Part of the project of the NIJ guide was to build a youth survey alongside youth about how they're experiencing their services. And we made it in a form that is changeable, so you can download it and adapt it to your own jurisdiction, and we encourage you all to do that. So we already talked a bit, and you heard at the beginning about the essential component of policy change that is changing narrative. This is why we focused our entire first webinar on it, but we're going to come back to it again. And you know, as in the framing of a lessons learned, we learned early on that we really needed to move away from blaming and criminalizing kids for what was going on, focusing on behavior rather than the circumstance, and instead move towards understanding what had happened to them as abuse, as victimization. And again, this was focused on kind of shifting from a juvenile legal system response to a child welfare system response. One of the early campaigns led by Rights for Girls was the No Such Thing as a Child Prostitute campaign, recognizing that using the language of prostitution really implies choice and consent on young people for what would otherwise be sexual abuse or rape if no money or other thing of value was exchanged. And this is was and continues to be a really important narrative shift when we're thinking about how we prevent and address commercial sexual exploitation. And we want you to encourage changing the narrative, thinking about changing the narrative We want to push the boundaries on that. So as I mentioned, kind of early on, it was focused on that JJ to child welfare narrative, and we want to push it even further because we now know that there are harms in using all sorts of labels on children. So the move from using quote unquote child prostitute to CSEC or commercial sexually exploited child has caused harms in itself. So we hear people referring to kids directly, individuals, as CSECs. And this is problematic. Kids internalize those labels. They know what it means. It can also prevent young people from getting services that they need. So we hear, unfortunately, frequently that there are blacklists, or that if a kid has that label in their file, they won't be admitted to certain services. Foster care providers and even parents refuse to have young people in their homes if they have this label because of fear, because of this idea that they're the harder kids or that they're going to cause harm to other children in the family. So again, we need to push back on using these labels. We also want to think about changing the narrative about who's impacted, broadening our understanding of what this really looks like on the ground. A big part of our narrative change efforts now are understanding that this issue doesn't only affect cisgender girls. We'll talk about this in a moment and one of the other lessons learned, but just wanted to highlight that kind of the traditional view, the traditional image of trafficking is often a blonde white girl being swept away into a van, or a Black girl running away from foster care, or with her hand in her head in her hand sitting in a juvenile hall cell. These images do not represent the full picture of what's going on, and they actually perpetuate a lot of biases that prevent us from recognizing the span of young people that are impacted and the way that CSE can look. So we know that although research is minimal, CSE impacts boys and male youth nearly at equal rates to cisgender girls. We know that trans youth and non-binary youth, gender expansive youth are impacted disproportionately. And we also know that Native youth, Asian youth, and other groups are being under-identified. And then one other piece on narrative change, and then I'll pass it to April, is that, we've talked a bunch so far about decriminalization and moving away from arresting and prosecuting young people, but it can't only be that. Our decriminalization efforts have to be accompanied by investments in off-ramps, in things like financial support, in true education and employment opportunities and housing opportunities, because these are the things that help people to stay out of exploitation and to move on and live the thriving lives that folks deserve to live. So decriminalization has to be coupled with service provision and investments. And as April noted earlier, with addressing the collateral consequences of criminal legal involvement that folks may still be having or may have had in the past. April, I'll pass it to you to talk about the last piece here.
Thank you. And when we look at, youth, and we look at them in their whole selves with their agency and understanding that we are trying to reduce harm, understanding that their family component plays a large part. And we've seen historically how CPS, welfare, and youth who are caught up in the legal system, their families have not been supported. We're looking at children who have come from the most underserviced demographic. They have a serious need. A lot of them have food insecurities, housing instabilities. And before it's been looked at like poverty just for the Black and brown communities, but we're seeing this across the nation. Everybody is struggling right now. So how are we looking at people in their whole selves and allowing youth to, one, have agency and choices to say, I would like to go live with my cousin. This is probably a good place for me right now. And then looking at the cousin and the cousin's needs, and how are we supporting the cousin? Are we helping the cousin get therapy? Are we making sure that the cousin's house is safe? Are we supporting this family as a whole? like right now for the organization that I work for, we are 4 branches, and we just launched one of our pieces, which is called Beloved Community Housing. And in that, there's a parent navigator that helps the parent navigate the systems. We provide financial support to the parent, while there's a youth navigator that's helping the youth navigate the legal system, the justice system. And so we're trying to create a complete wraparound service for the youth as well as the parent, so that if the issue is just the parent needs parenting classes, let's help the parent get to the class, because it might be something as simple as a bus token. Let's help the parent get to the class. Let's help the parent navigate these systems that are not the easiest to navigate, help them meet these counselors, help them get to where they need to go so that they can be reunited with their child. And so, like I said, we're doing it simultaneously. We're doing it hand in hand, because while we're helping the youth, we're helping the parent. We're also in the court systems talking to the judges, because sometimes it's something simple. It's not always, I don't want to say a stigma, but it's not always as grave and as dramatic as the media or the narrative has been told in the past about how harmful parents are. It might be something simple as a need in an instant, and something that we can easily feel for the parents. And so, like, how do we make this easy, and how do we look at this holistically, and how do we make sure that we're keeping families safe and we're reducing harm for the youth at the same time?
Thank you, April. And I just want to put a point on one of the things you said, which is that when we're thinking about the narrative change piece, there is a lot of blame on families. There is a lot of blame on parents whose children have this experience. And when we talk to parents, they feel that deeply. And many of them have asked for help. They knew something was going on with their child, and they reached out for help and couldn't get it. And it was only until something really bad happened, when their kid got in trouble or there was serious abuse, that they could get that help. And that's really painful. I mean, you can see the pain in families when you talk to them about this. And so we want to push back on that, like, labeling and blaming of kids and also of families, and move towards, as April said, a system where we're really supporting folks in their communities instead. So this dovetails to the next lesson learned, which relates to recognizing and addressing the impact of race and gender-based oppression in your community. We touched on this already, but commercial sexual exploitation does not exist in a vacuum. Many of the same kind of isms, racism, sexism, colonialism, capitalism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these things that cause broader discrimination in our society and account for disparities in the juvenile legal and child welfare systems also impact commercial sexual exploitation. And it impacts CSE in a number of ways. So first, who's victimized? It puts these isms put particular kids at risk. My coworker, Maria, who's our community policy associate, always likes to mention, it's not the identity of the young person. It's not that they're a Black child or, that they're trans that puts them at risk. It's the societal biases against their identities that puts them at risk. So we need to address those things directly. So it impacts who is victimized. We know that young people, that youth of color are disproportionately impacted. We also know that that homophobia impacts vulnerability. For example, a young person who might be rejected by their family because they're gay and has to, go out and survive on the street might engage in survival sex or be at a higher risk of being trafficked by somebody else because they're surviving. So those things impact who's victimized. They also impact who is identified. So we are identifying higher numbers of young people within certain demographic groups. So for example, the law enforcement first responder protocol in LA, 70% of the young people who are identified are Black. 7 to 8% of the child population in LA is Black. So it's hugely disproportionate. And it's likely in part because Black and brown girls are disproportionately impacted, but it's also because these communities face more surveillance and policing. So if police and law enforcement are the primary way we are identifying kids who are being trafficked, they're going to identify more Black and brown kids. So we need to broaden the way that we are identifying folks to ensure that the discrimination in other places in our society aren't also contributing to who we're identifying as exploited. It also means we're missing kids. This connects to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives crisis. We are under-identifying Native youth and others. We're under-identifying boys and trans non-binary kids, even though, as I said, we know that they're impacted. And these things also impact how folks are treated once they're identified and what access to services that they have. So if we know, because of kind of sexist, misogynist views in our society, we don't believe boys can be exploited because they're in control of their bodies or because all males desire sex, so how could they possibly be trafficked? Then we're not going to identify those kids and we're not going to offer services that they need, even if they are being victimized and they are in need. And we know this also is internalized. So we recently spoke to a number of young people, and the language of trafficking and CSEC people don't identify with it. And so if they don't identify as an experience that they have had, they're not going to seek services and they're not going to get the help that they need. So I'm kind of going into the call of action, and I'll turn it back to April for this, but we really do need to tailor our services to different populations, given that we know that CSE impacts such a range of folks. April, to you.
Thank you, May. And so as we look at how are we moving forward, we need to recognize and address the impact of race and gender-based oppression on exploitation in our community. We've learned that we can address human trafficking without addressing poverty, mental health, and community violence. What we've been noticing, especially in Sacramento, our highly trafficked area, they're always in communities. Wherever there's, I call it's the blade. I'm sorry if you guys aren't familiar with that terminology, but whenever there's a blade, they're always in areas that don't have the best lighting. They're in the areas that experience the most poverty. Children are having to walk past these areas where people are constantly searching and looking for people to buy as they go to school, as they go to the grocery store. And we need to understand how demand impacts the community. What I've been asking Sacramento is, how is it that Walmart, a huge corporation, has an area that is the most, it's not lit, but it's an area that has access to all streets. How are we reducing the demand in this area? How are we keeping this community safe? How are we deterring people from coming to this Walmart parking lot to buy sex? When people think about demand, they always think about incarceration or how are we arresting? What are we doing? Demand is about also keeping your community safe and implementing street lights, implementing better stop signs that are working or that work to a certain timer. How are we keeping the community safe with the police who are just patrolling the area? What are we doing in our communities? We talk about public safety, and I'll keep on talking about demand. And we need to make sure that our communities are protected. If I was to go to Beverly Hills, the lights are on, the lights are bright. We need the same type of care that we have in these demographics that have more wealthier populations. We need the same type of care in any demographic. We also need to have wraparound services, making sure that as we do encounter these people and as we're bringing our services to the community, are we taking care of people? Are we providing outreach supplies? Are we making sure that people have safety kits? Are we providing the necessary tools so that people have the education and the information to the community-based services that can help them and help their families as they are trying to escape or leave this life? Making sure the bills that we have been working on for the last 4 or 5 years have been really trying to highlight what does it look like to see survivors clearly, to identify survivors and not criminalize people. And we have a long way to go. Last year, we saw some bills come forward that, as I said earlier, they looked harmless, but they were extremely harmful to young people who were being exploited, who possibly could not identify themselves. And because in the Black and Brown community, young Black girls are highly criminalized, highly adultified, super sexualized, like everything about them, we do not view them as children. We view them as grown adults. So when they encounter the system, they're not being seen as victims. They're being seen as people who have chosen to be a part of this lifestyle. They are children. So how are we identifying these children and providing safety exits from these lifestyles that they have been stolen into, quite frankly? We also saw a lot of fear mongering around these policies. When we think about politicians, I mean, it's true, it's politics for them. People have their, I don't want to go too far in that, I apologize. So we just need to be mindful that as we do engage in these policies, that we're reading the actual policies, that now we're not getting caught up in the one-liner social media campaigns, and that we actually know what these policies are going to do. And if we don't agree, we can write our local member, we can write our assembly member, we can ask questions, we can reach out to the CBOs who are working on these policies, and we can ask, how does this play out? Who does this affect? Is there ways that we can make this a better policy, that it can be more safe for people? And don't get caught up in these social media campaigns, because a lot of times what we think we are passing in its entirety does not include the provisions that protect survivors and keep people safe. So we need to be more engaged in the policies that are coming forward so that we understand exactly how they play out in real life, not how they read on paper. And so, I'm sorry, can we go to the next slide, please? And so the next slide is lessons learned in survivor leadership. And so currently, NICL has a CSEC Action Team Advisory Board, which takes, I feel like it's like 10 right now, 10 experts throughout the state of California who are subject matter experts who have lived experience to consult, to engage, to educate throughout the state of California on all the facets of CSEC and commercial sexual exploitation. NICL is ensuring that lived experience experts are involved in policy and advocacy, and that their voices are at the table. And so with this, any organization that would like to reach out to NICL, who would like to have a consultant to come to their team to educate, to understand the differences and the nuances, NICL will provide people to be able to consult with organizations. And so the beautiful thing about the action team is that the experts are allowed to glean off of each other, because we all had different backgrounds and different lived experiences, and like everybody's experience isn't the same. And so how are we learning? How are we educating? How are we different demographics, different counties? How are we making sure, because we're all trying to move to a common goal. So how are we all communicating and educating each other? What we've also learned with people with lived experience is that we need to make sure that we're paying them for their expertise. The same way that we view a consultant in any other field is the same way that we need to view consultants who are survivor leaders. We also need to create space. We need to be true allies. We need to make sure that we are walking hand in hand and creating platforms and then stepping back so that their voices can be amplified. They can take the lead. They can speak on something that they have lived, that they have overcome, and that they have the solutions to the problems. So how are we creating space, amplifying their voices, and allowing them to be their best selves as they navigate a problem and as we navigate this problem that we've been dealing with for many, many, many years? And so can we go to the next slide? And so we have another call to action. And so how are we creating space? How are we making sure that survivor stories aren't being cherry picked, that there's no cookie cutter example of what this looks like? And so NICL is gracious in how they navigate the relationships with organizations. They do the pre-consultation with the organization and with the advisory board to set the expectation and set the tone so that they know exactly what the need is from the organization, and then they make sure that they pair the right survivor leader with the organization. They can speak directly to the need at the organization, and they have the education to help navigate whatever topics that they would like to be discussed or educated on. Sometimes there's a hesitance to bring folks into space due to landscape. So I'll speak to my own experiences as last year. So last year we saw a war play out in the human trafficking space. And so for me as a person who was on the front line of working on policies, what we realized is that the Capitol loves for survivors to come tell their story and bleed all over the Capitol. That's what I call it. And so in that, as we are introducing people into the storytelling space and into this policy space, how are we bringing people in? Are we making sure that we're keeping them safe? Or are we just throwing them out to the front and re-exploiting people? Because it's a very traumatic experience when you have to come to advocate for a bill and tell your whole life story just for the bill to possibly not pass in public safety or possibly not pass in appropriations, or die on the floor. So how are we protecting survivors? How are we making sure that they don't have to continuously be re-exploited? And then, as we saw last year with all the drama that played out with these human trafficking bills, we saw survivors being drugged across the news and drugged on Twitter and like really just being harmed because of the way that the bills were being portrayed. And they were basically taking survivorship from survivors. So understanding that the landscape can become extremely harmful, are we making sure that we are preparing people for the harm, or are we also not bringing people into the harm because we understand that we need to protect people. We don't need to, just because we need to win or because we need their story or because, oh, they'll get it. Like, no, let's not cherry pick survivors. There's not just one survivor who fits the bill. It's a non-homogeneous community. There's no one size fit all, and that we need to make sure that we are not just harming people. Or there's also the dynamic of policymakers not wanting to use survivors or not wanting to use the experts or going to get the expert that's going to tell the story the way they want it told. So we need to, one, as we navigate these spaces, reach out to these legislators and these policymakers and ask them to bring in the community members and ask them to allow people who these bills would affect or will affect to make sure that their voices are at the table and that they're leading it. And then also, so it's a dynamic, also making sure that we are not bringing people who are brand new into these spaces to be harmed. That was a lot. And so, but we do want our people at the helm, because oftentimes we'll see policies made for them, not by them, that cause harm. So we just need to really be, see people as whole people as we move forward, and making sure that their voices are in space, we are protecting them, we are creating space, and that we are amplifying their voices and being true allies to the survivors that we are trying to educate California on and for.
Thank you so much, April. Hard to transition from that, but I'm gonna do it. So we wanted to come back to one of the things we mentioned earlier about the critical importance of coupling system responses with community-based responses. And as we noted, there's been this transition, or some of you may still be going the transition from kind of a juvenile legal response to a child welfare response. And we really now want to be moving more towards a community-based response, avoiding system involvement wherever we can, because as we heard today, there can be so much harm. So a couple of quick examples. As I noted, the first responder protocol in LA has always had a community-based organization partner. So in responding to young people, a community-based advocate, many of whom have lived experience or identify as kind of survivor advocates, are the ones who are responding to young people. We know that many young people are skeptical, to put it mildly, of law enforcement and other system folks. And so ensuring that there's a community-based advocate, a credible messenger is really critical. In LA, there's also been a deep investment, a financial investment in these advocacy services so that any young person who's identified as at risk or experiencing CSE can get longer term advocacy services, not just that crisis response. And in any multidisciplinary teaming, ensuring that there are folks from community-based organizations who can support the broader goals and needs of young people and families is really essential. And just a quick plug, this doesn't just go to kids, as we mentioned. So a number of organizations across California have started parent empowerment programs or something of that name to ensure that parents also understand what's going on, both as a preventative measure and then also those who have had that experience. And in many situations, they're partnered with another parent who has lived experience, who can serve as a mentor and help guide them through what they're going through. So resourcing and really investing in these community-based responses is essential. April, do you want to add anything about Sister Warriors?
Yes, I can talk about our ecosystem all day. Sister Warriors is the sibling org to the Young Women's Freedom Center, an org that's been around for 30 years that has been building power in the communities by bringing the young folks out of their communities and building the leadership and making sure that they have access and that they are having a gainful employment so that they can go on and be their best selves. And so in that, Sister Warriors was birthed, and I call us policy hubs because we're throughout the state of California, and we are taking people who are system impacted, and we are strategizing with them and coming up with policy solutions so that we can get to a world where everybody has equity and equality. And it's the people building their own power, making sure that they have access to what they need and that they, we don't need anybody to save us. We have the solutions. We just need to have access to the power and access to the conversations and access to the tables so that we can create the policies that our community needs. Thank you.
You started to talk about some of this, the first bullet, April. Do you want to continue on this or should I jump in?
Sure. And so what we've noticed as we've been building and growing in our ecosystem is that it takes a lot of different organizations that do specific things to get to a place where we all are free and we all have equality. And so when you talk about our ecosystem, we start at the top with an organization called Reimagine Freedom. And Reimagine Freedom is helping people learn about entrepreneurships and power and helping to develop their leadership, helping to develop their self-determination so that they can go on and go be entrepreneurs in their communities. They can go on to create these businesses that are, one, helping their communities and helping themselves and helping their families. And then next under them is the Beloved Community Housing Program, where, like I said earlier, we are helping navigate the youth as well as their parent through these systems while providing resources such as housing, funding, making sure that we are in communication with the social workers and the probation officers and the judges so that we can create like a cocoon around the family so that they can have what they need to be successful. And that's a 2-year program. And then underneath them is the Sister Warrior Freedom Coalition. And we have a framework that we have been using since 2020 that is our North Star. It's called our Freedom Charter, where we have written down what does the world look like where everybody has all the things that they need, from healthcare to how they want to practice their holistic medicine, how are they being housed, the food that they're receiving. And we have been building the power in our communities and educating on policy and also making the relationships with the policymakers so that we can go to the Capitol and we can show up for ourselves and we can help shift California in ways that's beneficial for everybody. And then we have the Young Women's Freedom Center, who start out as a survival project, going back into the same economies, underground street economies, and bringing our people out of it and educating them and showing them that they can be exactly whoever it is they want to be. We are encouraging their dreams and their goals. And so they come in, so I started from the top, but they come into the center. And then from the center, they become a sister warrior. And then we also are addressing their needs. We're making sure that their immediate needs are being met as we navigate them through these systems, because people need, you can't just take a person from the streets and not address what all their instabilities are. What is it? Housing? Is it food? What are people struggling with as we navigate the systems, so that one, they can advocate for themselves, they're being provided for, and then we are pushing them off to go be Congress people, assembly people, but we're building people, whole people, as we think about the community.
Yes. Just a couple things. Thank you so much for laying that out. And I think, you know, you said this a few minutes ago, that like communities know what they need, right? So resource them. I think that's one of the big lessons that we want to share out with you all, is to make access easier. Make it easier for young people and families to access these types of amazing services that April just laid out without requiring system involvement. We need flexible funding to these organizations so that they can provide exactly what April just said, what people want and need in the spaces that are closest to their home, that are closest to their heart. And we hear from organizations that there's too much bureaucracy. This won't be a surprise to anyone, but often the organizations that are providing those really important services in communities can't even access the available funding and resources because it's so resource intensive just to manage a contract, just to do an RFP. So how do we think about loosening up, cutting some of that red tape so that we can get these critical services to youth and families? We already mentioned talking about expanded support for underidentified populations and funding just innovative practices on the ground. And just one quick plug for evaluation of all these programs, as Carly mentioned, because that's what kind of ensures that they can continue to do the important work that they're doing. So I'll be quick on this one since we're running short on time, but we did want to highlight that one of the really important pieces of doing all of this policy and practice change is the role of bridge builders. So our organization has been able to support a lot of this work by bringing expertise about what's happening in other jurisdictions and about CSE and the issue generally. Really importantly, being able to bring together collaborative partners. All of this takes a lot of work, and we're often asking people to do this on top of their existing workload, which isn't feasible. So it can be really important to bring in a backbone organization to help support that work and provide expertise and technical assistance to navigate disagreements and tensions, and then to actually write some of these policies and protocols and help support monitoring and implementation. There's often a write the policy and leave. And, you know, it's important to help build the infrastructure for actually implementing and seeing how the policy changes work and then adapting them if needed.
So I'll just say quickly, I began working with Nickel in, I think it was 2017, as part of a board mandated research project. And I have not stopped working with them since then. And the entire time that May has worked at Nickel, I think she's worked with me for better or worse. But the reason for that is because I've seen how successful they are at putting those pieces together on the ground. They are the bridge between what I can produce and share from the research, for example, and the folks on the ground, be it youth, families, service providers, policymakers, and so on. So they're the connector to so many organizations, individuals, and knowledge. Nickel's really a great example of this. And I would say CJJR also does similar work in juvenile justice reform and cross-system collaboration as well. We really need ongoing support and recognition of these bridge builders as part of this work. Next slide. In LA, again, I'll just be quick. We've been really lucky to have a lot of champions for change. So, for example, Michelle Guyman and Judge Pratt, who started off this work with the STAR Court and the Child Trafficking Unit and probation, which we discussed in webinar 2. But importantly, these champions were also supported by the Board of Supervisors. And the Board of Supervisors has been able to also provide accountability. So, for example, they've instituted an integrated leadership team that had to report back to them on the status of the work. And there's currently a steering committee in the county who drives a lot of this work. But I'll turn it back to April to close us out, and then we'll transition to some questions.
Thank you. And so how are we identifying and supporting champions for change? I have mentioned my organization and our ecosystem throughout this whole presentation, because I believe in the work that we are doing as a person who has been impacted by every system. And I'm seeing the work that we're doing and how it's playing out. And so I also want to highlight other organizations like the Anti-Recidivism Coalition and the Mission, what I've seen happen. And so those of you who are familiar with that organization, those of you who are not, Scott Budnick took his position and his power position in Hollywood as a producer, left Hollywood, took all of his contacts and all of his resources and basically handed them to formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated people, and gave us his platform for about 10 years. And so we were able to amplify, we were able to do policy changes, we were able to just move in a way that I had never seen really done before on that landscape. And so how was Scott an ally? Scott didn't talk for us. He moved out the way and let us talk for ourselves. So ARC and the model and how they are giving people proximity to these movers and shakers in Hollywood, and making sure that their voices are heard and amplified on a large scale is a movement that people should go to kind of look at and check into. Sister Word Freedom Coalition, we are building power politically so that we can help people, one, lead these policy changes and build their own understanding and their critical conscience so that they can go on to go be the next assembly member and the next senator. YWSC also building young leaders, teenagers, making sure that they understand their brilliance and educating them so that they can be leaders of change in their communities as well. And then there's another organization, Community Against Sexual Harm, which is a survivor-led organization that has the most beautiful peer-to-peer model that I've ever seen. But the issues that we're also seeing is that a lot of times funders want to fund the work and not necessarily the person. So how are we making sure that, one, the work is funded and also people's salaries are being paid? And as we're working with these populations, how are we building their social capital, as what ARC was doing? And as we're all doing, how are we building their social capital and giving them proximity to people and allowing their voices to be heard as we're building out their capacity, making sure that we are building them to be these brilliant, magnificent leaders. And as we work on this as a complete and as a whole, Nickel also has is bringing in impacted people and making sure that they are also able to use their voices in places that typically our voices aren't heard in. So how are we making people proximate? How are we making sure that we're funding the work? How are we highlighting and supporting the organizations that are doing the work? And are we listening to the people who are being supported by these organizations and asking them, what do they need? What organizations are providing the most support? And I'm still, but put the money back into this picture. Are we funding the work as well as the person? Because people need to survive as they're doing this work.
Thank you so much. I know we went a little over our expected time. Alex, I see you popped back up, so maybe you're gonna take it from here. I don't know if we got any questions. I think you can unmute yourself if you wanna maybe ask a question or throw something in the chat or any comments.
So while folks are thinking about their questions, and please do feel free to put your questions in the chat. I just want to thank you, Carly, May, and April. I'm kind of astounded that this is our last webinar on this topic, because I feel like I still have so much to learn from you all. This theme of taking the leap of faith, and that oftentimes, we need to recognize our own trepidations might stand in the way of us being those champions. April, I love that idea of being a champion for change and being a champion of the champions. Thinking about the April, you made this comment about demand and how commercial sexual exploitation is not just perpetuated by demand, but by the fact that our communities might be dark, or the fact that we don't have the services that we need in those communities, or that the folks in the communities need. Carly and May, you raised the points about having reflexivity in our policies and our programs, and actually examining what the impact of those are, and having a willingness to revise them. My thoughts are all over the place. You all were fantastic, and I'm just so honored that you spent some time with us today. Do folks have any questions? If not, I've got my own questions I'll ask, but I do want to open it up for our participants if anyone's got anything that comes to mind for our amazing speakers. So I'm not seeing anything come through right now. I'm sure everyone else's wheels are kind of turning, but one thing that I want to go back to is this topic of prevention. You all had talked about, really leaning into prevention. And one of the things that comes to mind for me are school programs. Now, I do think that prevention of commercial sexual exploitation, just as the name, in having that be a prevention program in schools, might be a hard sell. But in terms of what prevention programs you all have heard of that have worked in schools, or even just ideas that you have, I feel like schools are such an instrumental part of communities. They have access to professionals, to parents and guardians, and of course to our young people. So if you all have any thoughts on prevention programs for schools, I'd love to hear them.
I have a thought.
Go
So
for it, April.
we worked on a report in Sacramento as the Community Against Sexual Harm, and it addressed prevention, and we talked about it in schools. And what we realized is what was missing. And what was missing was a school nurse. There was a time back in my day, I don't want to age myself too much, but back in my day, every school had a school nurse, and you could go, you had a relationship with this nurse, and you could go see this nurse. And now they have a rotating nurse that might be at a school every other week. And so when the school nurse will be able to see this kid comes in 3 times a week or once a week, or why is this kid here? The school nurse is able to kind of address and see what's going on. And so what we realized as far as the schools, that was something that was missing, was a school nurse. And all the policing in schools, like we're policing our children. And so we've created these unsafe environments. And while we talk about these pipelines, when children are used to being supervised, they're continuously supervised. And then I don't want to say they just magically end up in prison, but supervision becomes something that they're continuously used to. But the main point that I want to highlight is a school nurse. I think the schools need nurses back, and each school needs their own nurse, so that each child can build a relationship and build rapport with that one individual who can see warning signs and address them as they arise.
Just
Yeah.
one quick point. Oh, Carly put an example of a curriculum in the chat, but what I want to highlight about it is that it is across the age spectrum. So it starts really early and is focused on how do we talk about this in a developmentally appropriate way. So with younger kids, it's about healthy relationships and boundaries and consent and all of those sorts of things. And so as you mentioned, it can be hard to bring in this idea of human trafficking to a 6-year-old, but you can talk about boundaries and healthy relationships. And that's the piece that needs to start really early. And that's what young people told us. Like, when we're learning about consent, also tell us about this, So that's one example of that. And it needs to continue. It often doesn't start until middle school or high school, and that's too late.
Absolutely. No, those are all great points. I do recognize that we are over time, so I'm going to wrap us up, but thank you all so much. This was absolutely outstanding. And I want to encourage folks to reach out to you. You all are a wealth of knowledge. And, if our participants, if you enjoyed this series, please be on the lookout for future CJJR webinars. We've actually got a June webinar coming up on June 5th at 2 p.m. Titled Empowering Youth Voices, Building Partnerships for Sustainable Transformation in the Youth Justice System. And the registration for that is there in the chat. And April, Carly, and May, thank you so much. Again, I really can't thank you enough for spending this time with us, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your experience, and really leading by example. So thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.